right now. And since it's 7, I'm starting the webinar. Good luck, everyone. Have a great show.
Hello from Blue Willow Bookshop in Houston, Texas. My name is Kathy Berner, and I am delighted to welcome you here to this virtual event featuring Amor Towles in conversation with Ann Patchett for Amor's new book, The Lincoln Highway, which came out yesterday. We are thrilled to host this event in partnership with 3 amazing independent bookstores, the Book Stall in Winnetka, Illinois, Boswell Book Company in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and Parnassus Books in Nashville, Tennessee. If you are ever in any of those 3 cities, please make sure you go see them. They are amazing partners and wonderful members of their community and of the bookselling community. If you have any questions about the pickup or delivery of your copy of The Lincoln Highway, please contact the bookstore where you purchased your ticket to this event. Additionally, if you did choose shipping, please be patient. We all know how much the United States Postal Service is overwhelmed, and we did our very best to get all these books out the door. Before we get started, let's do some housekeeping. In case you're new to Zoom, congratulations. But this event is a webinar, which means you can see and hear us, but we can't see or hear you. As a reminder, all host bookstores expect all participants to maintain an atmosphere of respect and fairness. Any attendee who violates this standard of behavior through any form of harassment will be immediately removed. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask questions. And please upvote a question if you see one that you wanted to ask. We will get to them as time permits. That's it for me. You know both of these amazing, amazing authors. Let's give a great big welcome to Amor Towles and Ann Patchett.
Hello all. Hello everyone.
Hey Amor. We'll just wait for Ann. And there's Ann.
Hello, Ann.
Hi, Amor. Thank you so
let the
much, Kathy.
It's my pleasure. I'm going to let the 2 of you chat, and then I'll come back in later to ask questions. Let me know when you're ready, okay?
Okay. All right.
And before you start,
yes, please.
First, I want to say thank you everybody for coming. And this is a little bittersweet, this event. I think for me, for Ann too, I'm sure, but because I have spoken at all 4 of these lovely independents, and that's my preference. My preference would be to be there in the store with you, so that we can be together as we have whatever conversation we're about to have. On the plus side, if we were doing that, you would not have Ann Patchett there. So you get, that's the trade-off. You don't get me in person, but you do get Ann as a part of the trade, and that's a trading up. So Ann, I want to thank you for joining us tonight. It's a real treat to have you here.
It is such a trade-off, and yet there are so many people in tiny towns who tune into these programs, and that's been really a moving thing to me. I mean, there's something very democratic about about these streaming book talks because suddenly you can see just about anybody. So that's really wonderful too. Anyway, I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm thrilled to be with 3 other terrific bookstores and with you, my friend, because this actually isn't so unusual. Amor and I, we Zoom, we Skype, we talk to each other while looking at each other.
Yes, that was one of the gifts of this crazy era that we're going through, is that it prompted us to have Zooms together as a way of seeing each other, because otherwise you wouldn't have. And that has been a treat.
Yeah, and you're actually one of the few people that I know that if I would say, oh, let's get on the phone, you would say, no, let's Zoom.
It's true. It's true.
And I think it's because you had that fantastic backdrop.
That's why.
Yeah, that's absolutely the reason. I am so excited about this book, which I love, and I've been, like the rest of the world, been waiting for such a long time. And I was trying to remember the first time I heard anything about this book. I could be entirely wrong, but I think it's when we were having dinner in San Antonio. I don't even know how many years ago, but you were on the never-ending Gentleman in Moscow tour.
Yeah.
And we didn't know each other very well. And at some point I said, what do you think you're going to do if you ever get off the road? And you said?
Yeah. And I have this idea about this, kid who comes home from, well, this is the idea if you haven't read it yet, but, I had this vision, this notion of a kid coming home from a juvenile, work camp in the Midwest, being driven home by the warden. And he's just done time for what was basically an accident in many ways. And the warden is saying, you've paid your debt to society, and that was a freak accident. You're a good person. His father had died in the meantime. The farm is in foreclosure. And so the warden says, it's time to start your life fresh. And my notion was that he would pull into the farm and the warden would drive off, and it would turn out that 2 kids from the juvenile facility had hidden in the trunk of the warden's car, and basically have a very different plan for how the hero, Emmett Watson, should spend the next couple of weeks or months or years, and that was kind of the notion. And I don't know how it is for you. I don't think we've ever had this conversation, but for me, books always start with like a sentence. It's basically, guy gets trapped in a hotel for a long period of time, and literally, like, that was the beginning of Gentleman in Moscow. And when it's a sentence, like a notion like that grabs me, pretty quickly I can start to see things about it. I mean, so, in that case, I did start sort of with that notion. And then it was like, it's going to be in Russia. That's where it's going to be. And he'll be an aristocrat. He'll be under house arrest in a grand hotel. And that comes very quickly. And so in this case, when I had this notion of the kid coming home to the farm in the warden's car, for whatever reason, he was always going to be either Nebraska or Kansas. One of the guys in the trunk was going to be from a tough section of New York. It was going to be a 10-day story. And it was going to be in the mid-50s, and that just comes rushing at me, that type of information. And then from there, I start to build. And usually, and part of the reason I go through this is because when we were having that dinner all those years ago, that's very typical for me, which is that the notion is a decade old. And then I spend years kind of thinking about it and, filling whatever notebooks that look like this, with elements of the characters or the settings or the events, and, little passages that might end up in a chapter. And slowly I build my way towards then building an outline. And once I have an outline, then I'm ready to start chapter 1. So it is very possible that, we had a conversation about this idea, at minimum 5 years before the book arrived yesterday.
And my memory, which is completely different from yours, and yours would be better than mine, was that you told me you wanted to write a book that took place over 10 days.
Yeah, that's right.
And there was a 10-day countdown. I don't remember the kids. I don't remember how they got there, but it was what you were telling me about was a structure.
Yes.
And not a story. So
Yes.
I was wondering what comes first, the characters, the kid coming home from work camp, the kids in the trunk, or the notion of structure. I'm going to write this book that takes place over 10 days. And, Gentleman in Moscow goes on for decades.
Yeah.
You have this sense of like, I want to get time down.
Yeah. The structure comes like a second after the notion.
Okay.
So in the case of Rules of Civility, when I was like, I'm going to tell this story about this young woman who recognizes a friend in an old photograph, right away, I was like, it's going to be 1 year. And, it's going to start on New Year's Eve. It's going to end on New Year's Eve. And that's the way that, that leap allows me to start to visualize the story more clearly, because it sets some ground rules right off the bat, because I know what type of space I'm filling, and I know what kind of pace of storytelling I'm going to be dealing with. I know how much opportunity the characters will have to evolve. That all comes with that structural decision. With A Gentleman in Moscow, I knew right away it was going to be 30 years plus. And so that says, well, okay, well, now we're going to age. The society is going to change. You're going to meet people and the relationships are going to evolve. Kid is going to, come in at one point and be an adult later. And so, those things come out of that decision. And so, yes, I think that I immediately thought of this as a 10-day story, but my desire to write this book next certainly was because I just spent 5 years writing a 30-year book. And it was sort of nice to have the challenge and to some degree the relief, I guess, of writing a book with a very different aperture, because you still are trying to bring into this narrow space of time elements of the past, intimations of the future that you actually get to spell out in a 30-year book. But here you have to kind of build them into the framework of the days, and I'll just say one other thing about it, which I'm not going on too long about this, but one of the weirdest things that happened in the course of crafting this book, because I do design it in advance, was that and I remember telling you this story when around the time it happened, the original plan was the 10 sections would be called day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. And each day you'd hear from different perspectives, and then you have day 2, et cetera. And, so all told, it would be more than 10 chapters because of all the various viewpoints. But I got to the midpoint of the book and I was totally frustrated. I felt like there were chapters that weren't working. I felt like I wasn't sure where I was going, even though I had the outline. I still wasn't confident about that. I felt like I was treading water, that I was being redundant, like I am now. So I had the classic mid-book loss of confidence. And so for me, I got to take a step back when that happens, and sort of walk away from the desk, wander for a couple of days, and in this case, what happened is it's sort of at some moment walking around the city or whatever, I was like, you know what? This book is not day 1, day 2, day 3. This book is 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And I went back and I immediately changed the headings of the sections just to say 10, 9, 8. I didn't change the order of events in any way, but I went back to the beginning and kind of read through with that in mind, that yeah, this is a countdown. That's what this is. It's a race against time. And one of the things I love about the countdown of 10 is that we use it to launch rocket ships, and we use it to signal the end of a boxing match. The guy is done. And we use it to signal the end of a year and the beginning of the new year, one or the other. It means one or the other, right? And so the countdown can mean different things. But as soon as I kind of had that, it gave me a chance to sort of streamline the story, rethink about the story, change the tenor of certain sections, eliminate some parts and amplify others that were a part of that feeling of 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, whatever that means.
Yeah, because it really does. And I don't know if it's just because I heard about the structure really early on, but it feels like a book that is really born of the structure. And it's good. It's a lot of pages and you're holding it together in that way. The book reads so fast. Do you have any tricks of the trade, or, is that important to you, that that this is a book that people are really going to be ripping through?
One of the things that you and I have talked about in the past is that I like to, one of the ways I view one of the ways I manage my own writing process is that I like to do the first draft for myself without anybody in mind, without, the reader in mind, without my peers in mind, without, publishing house in mind, whatever. And so that means I'm willing to fill it with all of my vanities and my errors in judgment, and, boring sections, and, misguided sections, and all the pretentious parts, the whole thing. It all goes in, comic parts that don't make sense, surreal parts that don't make sense, overwritten paragraphs, everything. But then what I do is, when the first the first draft is complete, then I like to kind of rotate it a little bit and think about and do the revision for the reader, with the reader in mind. And what the reader in mind means to me is, maybe it's a person who doesn't exist. Maybe it's, Edith Wharton or William Faulkner. Maybe it's someone like you. What it's somebody out there. But my thought process is that there's a sort of a covenant that we go into with our readers, you with yours, me with mine. We're going to ask them to buy the book. More importantly, we're asking them to spend a lot of time with the book. And I sort of feel like when they've agreed to do that, it's my responsibility to take that first draft that's full of all my, weaknesses in essence, and clean it up, and to, eliminate parts that are unnecessary, to eliminate parts that are arbitrarily confusing, to eliminate cliches, but one of the things that comes out of that process, I think, for me, is that pace is a factor. Is as I'm rereading that draft for the 100th time, I'm coming at it, I'm going to be easy to bore at that point, because I know everything that's happening. And so I'm really going in and saying, this chapter has to hold my interest, even though I've read it so many times. And that means, this part's dragging for me, or this part is not relevant, or this is not the most concise and poetic way to put this larger idea. And I should say that this movement of what I'm talking about, editing for some reader, it does not mean that I make the book easier or more accessible or more popular. Many times it's the opposite. I'm taking things out that potentially make the book more challenging, because there's more unsaid. And that's the funny thing about an unsaid thing, is it actually adds pace, because you don't have to slow down to go through it, but you do have to trust the reader when they come to that moment, that they're going to sort of somehow internalize what just happened. What change in emotion has occurred, or what change in sort of position of the characters, what fateful event is being intimated, but in a very short series of words. And so I think that's one of the things, is I like to read it for pace a little bit, and so I'm glad to hear that was your experience.
Yeah, absolutely. So what you're saying is that you don't get day 6 just right before you go on to day 5.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up, because I think it was at the same dinner in Austin. We've seen each other, many times over the years.
I called Miley Malloy just before we got on and said, "Where did we have dinner with Amor?" And she said, "Portland."
Yeah, that was in Portland, Portland, Oregon. But so at one, I think it was the dinner in Austin. You're like, well, how do you work? And so I'm saying, well, I do this, I do that, I do this. And you're like staring at me. And I'm like, well, how do you work? And you did the opposite of everything I did, And so it was like, one example was, I said, well, I move, through the first, I outlined very carefully, but then I move through the first draft, and a lot of it's unfinished. I have many chapters that are not perfect yet. And then, then I go back, and I just go back to the beginning, and I revise as we go. And you're like, what? I don't go to, I may be misquoted, but you're like, I don't go to chapter 2 until chapter 1 is perfect. And
that's true.
And then I'm like, well, then I take the thing when I've cleaned it up, and I like to hand it to 5 people on the same day. I don't share my manuscript with anybody, including my wife, my editor, my agent, until I'm done. And then it goes to 5 people, and I kind of ask them to give me feedback within 60 days, so that I can have kind of a series of lunches, in essence, where I hear their different takes. And again, you were shaking your head, and you were like, I would never do that. You said like, I would take, why would I ask 5 people to do the same job? That's not fair to them. I want to take the first person, make the book better, so that the second person actually has a better book to analyze. And so did I get those right about you? I mean, it was something.
You did, absolutely.
So, and by the way, the reason I go into this is because for those who listen, I think it's very valuable to remember that that if you like Ann's work, you like my work, we writers approach this process at almost every step of the way in extremely personal ways that are, and writers figure out their own habits of behavior that have worked well for them, but they may be totally different than, Richard Russo's or, anybody else's or Ann Patchett's. And that's part of the fun of it.
Sure, absolutely. It's a sort of it's like all the roads that lead to God. You can be a Lutheran, you can be a Hindu, but you're all taking the same path to hopefully get to the same spot at the end. Okay, so I'm listening to what you're saying. And yet I remember you saying to me so many times that the last day one, was all in your head.
Yes.
And you were anxious, like it was completely written in your head, but you had to get days 10 through 2 straight.
Yeah, right.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's pretty. I mean, I tend to have a very clear sense of a book's ending when I begin, and that's a part of the whole. And I'm always designing a book towards the conclusion. And I may have said this to you at one point, but I feel that some books that I've read, that you can read them and they feel like, they feel like this, that the author starts with this wonderful opening or wonderful premise or, wonderful, conflict or wonderful character. And you can feel the book kind of all, widening as things are happening and getting to know events. But sometimes you just feel like it kind of keeps kind of the back half of the book. It's like you get a sense that they didn't know what to do. They didn't know where they were going with this. And it can be a frustrating experience for me as a reader to sort of suddenly have that feeling in the back half of the book that it's sort of separating out somehow. And so I try to write like that a little bit, where I kind of know where I'm going and I'm asking myself all the time, do these earlier events, do they move towards that terminal point? Do the themes, do the development of the characters, is the tone of the language all moving towards this, fixed point at the end? And so that is, a part of it. And that does mean that in the front half, that's where the crowded, weird place is for me, where I have to make sure all those parts are working, because if I do, then the final 30% of the book, I just feel like it writes itself, because it's the culmination of all these other things that I've been thinking about and working towards.
That's an interesting point. I am a strong finisher. I'm a very weak starter. I will spend 6 to 8 months writing the first 20 pages of a book. I'm good in the middle. I am great at the end. And I know other people who it's completely the inverse. Like they just can go, they're strong out of the gate. I'm so weak out of the gate. But the farther I go, the more I know what I'm doing. It's like putting up a house, the basement, the planning, the digging, the framing. But then once you start putting those little details on, you getting the windows in, that's candy.
I think of the same metaphor, because also if you don't, once you make those decisions, once you put up the 2x4s and you lay the plumbing, before the rooms are there, it gets very difficult to start changing the shape of that house later.
Right.
So you want to make sure you've got all those decisions done. So I really think a great deal about that first third. Make sure that I'm very happy with it, before I start dipping into the second half. Because I know that if I run into a problem, it's going to be almost impossible or painful to fix at that point.
Exactly. Like you can't decide halfway through, you know what? There's a fifth boy in that car.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Oh yeah. Why not? They're twins. I don't know. But yes.
Favorite boy? Was there one that was just closest to your heart? They are all such profound individuals and you treat them all with so much tenderness. And I just wondered in your heart of hearts if there was one that you really loved the most.
Well, I think that you're right that an aspect of the writing process for me is, as I do even the bad guys, I like to fall in love with the characters a little bit. And so that they are infused with some element of my admiration for them or my, affection for them or my, they make me laugh or whatever it is, some personal connection that I have to each one of them, and And that helps in hearing their voices, in allowing their stories to be fulfilled in a way that is true to their idiosyncrasies. But, I think that from the very beginning, in a way, the youngest, Billy, is the one that I feel the greatest affection for. And maybe that, maybe that's natural. You take 3 18-year-old boys and an 8-year-old boy, an 18-year-old, young woman, or 19-year-old young woman. And it's hard. You will never like those 4 or 18 or 19-year-olds as much as you're going to like the 8-year-old boy, because they're that fresh innocence of that age and the wide-eyedness of that age. And so in constructing the book, I kind of knew, and for those who haven't read it yet, it does go through different voices. So you're shifting through perspectives as you go. I knew that I was going to eventually hear from Billy, that we would hear from Billy. But I also felt like, it's going to be at the very end or close to the very end. And that kind of became a very interesting part of my relationship to him, which is not wanting to hear him too soon, not wanting to have him to be just another character. I liked the fact that he's driving a lot of the action of the other characters unintentionally, in many ways. And but that we weren't going to really hear what he thought about it all until we were well into the game, but yeah, so I suppose it is Billy.
Tell us about Billy's book.
Billy is 8 years old, and his mother and Emmett's mother, Emmett is 18, so they're 10 years apart, and their mother left them when Billy was born. And and in the modern parlance, probably suffered from postpartum depression, maybe, or the equivalent, but suddenly finds herself, mother of 2. She grew up in the Northeast. Her husband also grew up in the Northeast with reasonably well-to-do family, and has given everything to sort of his dream of becoming an Emersonian farmer. And I think she's just exhausted, And so out of, for self-survival, leaves eventually and disappears along the Lincoln Highway headed west, out to the West Coast. And that has obviously a big impact on the boys, in terms of how they're shaped, but Billy in particular. And so, because he didn't have that mother figure. But he's a reader. He's a very particular little kid. He's a little awkward maybe, but the librarian in town, God bless librarians, always, gives him this compendium, Abacus Abernathy's compendium of intrepid travelers and other adventures. And it's this book of 26 adventure stories, with, in alphabetical order, 26 heroes, with A being Achilles, and moving itself down. And he has read the book 20 times in that way that young, children, kids can, when they really attach themselves to something, and it can, take over their thought process. And yes, naturally, this becomes the sort of the heroic stories in this book become also a backdrop for the events that they're going through themselves, and one of my favorite moments in the book is Billy is sort of alone. It's suddenly in a train for a variety of reasons, and he's by himself. He's in danger, in a way, as an 8-year-old boy on a train. He's sort of in danger, and this African-American, middle-aged African-American veteran named Ulysses shows up, and they sort of meet, and the veteran's intention is to sort of get rid of the kid. He rides alone on the freight trains, and he has no interest in the kid. And so the minute the train slows down, he's gonna get rid of him, and says as much. And but it comes up that his name is Ulysses, and the boy, Billy starts to ask him about that name. Says, "Well, did you fight in a war?" And the guy's like, "Yeah, of course I fought in a war. I thought we all fought." And he said, "Well, was it overseas?" And he's like, "Yeah, we all were overseas." And he said, "Well, were you reluctant to go? And did you leave a wife and child behind?" And the guy's kind of freaked out at this point. And he's, because this is true. It is what has happened to him. And Billy says, "You know what? I know who you're named for." And the guy says, "I'm named for Ulysses S. Grant." Of course, the general, Abraham Lincoln's general, who fought in the Civil War. And he says, no, you're named for the great Ulysses, who also went reluctantly to a war, and, ended up, couldn't get home to his wife and child, and ended up traveling and wandering until eventually, after 10 years, he made it back. And this kind of shakes this older man. So it also gives him sort of a glimmer of hope. Is it possible, that my wandering, because he's been wandering ever since, I'm sorry, I didn't mention that. When he comes back from the war, his wife and child, he can't find them or they've left. And he's been wandering alone. So, and he feels that it's his fault because his wife said, don't go to the war. If you come back, I'm not going to be here. And she's as good as her word. But one of the things I love about that sort of sequence was that it comes from this one word. You have this word Ulysses, and it means one thing to the boy and a different thing to this African-American veteran. And they couldn't be more different as people from where they're from and what their lives are like. And yet they make this connection through the word. But then they kind of trade these two different stories around the word, my Ulysses versus your Ulysses. And that kind of opens up a relationship between the two of them. They suddenly have a connection because of this. And so as I say, that's kind of the way suddenly you take this book, which has mythology in it and has Ulysses in it, and then suddenly you find it surfacing through, ideally some deeper and emotional strain between the characters.
Do you experience glee when you think, oh my God, he's going to have this book? I know what this book is going to be. Like, in my mind, that must have been so joyful, so much fun when you came up with that book.
And that was very early. The boy would have this book, and that there would be 26 chapters, and the heroes would be in alphabetical order. And I cannot tell you how many times, like in a bar waiting for my wife or whatever, I would take out a piece of paper and try to figure out the 26 heroes alphabetically. Right. Is it going to be so-and-so? Is it going to be so-and-so? Hamlet? It's going to be Hamlet, and you go down, and then I would see, take one out and put another one. It gave me endless pleasure. And it's, and a great procrastinating thing too.
You've got all these fantastic short stories lying around, really fantastic, big, long stories. Were you writing these stories while you were writing this novel?
And first of all, you're exaggerating. And second,
no, actually, I'm not. I read them.
But second of all, I like to write stories when I'm in between novels. For instance, I tend to do a lot in them because, I think, your experience may be like mine. When a novel comes out and you are going to spend some time on the road and meeting with readers to talk about that book, I find that to be a very difficult time to start a new novel. Because
sure.
my mind's not, I can't dedicate all the attention to it that I want to give. And so, but I can do short stories kind of in that phase. So kind of in the 9 months or whatever it is, while you're meeting or talking about the book before the paperback comes out, I will take my creative effort and turn it towards short stories so that because otherwise I go crazy, if I don't do something.
Book be a collection?
I've close to enough stories to have a collection. I thought that was going to come out after, I would do that after this book, but I think I'm actually going to do a fourth novel before the short stories.
Why not?
I'm in the mood to keep moving.
Why not? If you're on a roll, you might as well just keep rolling.
That's the way I look at it.
There's so many things I want to ask you. Do you have problems with cell phones, Amor? Do you have problems with cell phones in novels?
I don't. As you've seen, I've written 3 novels. Not one of them is in the era of the cell phone. So yeah,
I kept thinking, if Emmett could call Billy on the phone, there would be no book. There would be nothing.
There'd be no book. And it is. Somebody asked me that. Well, now, could you have set this story in another era? About this, and which is kind of a perplexing question. I don't mean to be mean to the questioner, but because if you think about it, this is 1954. If you went 10 years before, it's 1944, and you're in the middle of the Second World War, and you're at the back end of the Depression, right. And imagine young, 18-year-olds at that moment, and then maybe they're rushing off to war, having survived the Depression. 1964, 10 years after this, 1964, the Beatles have already landed. It's the middle, the British invasion has begun. You're 4 years away from Woodstock. The Vietnam War is going on, 18-year-old boy then, it's a totally different experience. So it is, you as you move across time, you hit a spot, and it has all kinds of impact. Of course it does, in in defining what the characters are going to be like, in what, what they aspire to, what they're worried about, what's going to happen to them, what the social and thematic context is. It's all different, And so, yes, have I gone out to now into the Twitter, cell phone, WhatsApp era, Facebook era? I have written some short stories in our era, and but it is, and eventually I will probably write a novel in our era, but I don't sort of crave, writing with all those accessories scattered around the house.
So what era is this next novel going to be in? I won't ask you more than that.
It's a spanner. It's a spanner, and it will reach. It'll conclude near in around 2000. So it might be like 1940 to 2000. So something like that.
Somebody might have a phone. Should we let other people ask questions, because there are so many of them stacking up, or we can just ask you questions forever? Hey,
Kathy's going to come and join us and help sort through this.
Yeah,
we'll do that. There are so many, and there are more than 700 people watching. Also, like, how lovely is that for us to have this communal experience?
That's beautiful. Hi, everybody. Thank you.
We are so grateful. Okay, so a question from Catherine. How big a role do your editors play in your books, for both of you?
Yeah, for both. You want to go first, Ann?
My editor doesn't play any role in my book. My friends. Okay. Yeah, there you go. I have really wonderful friends who read for me, and I like to turn my homework in when it's all done. And then my editor says, thank you very much.
I'm probably in the spectrum of activity. I'm closer to Ann. Paul Slovak has been my editor for all three of my novels, and is a great editor and a great reader, and has worked with terrific people who I admire. I try to give him something. I try to challenge him by giving him something that it's not obvious where he can step in. Now he does give me great feedback, and part of that, my first draft, my finished draft that I hand in, which is usually second or third draft, I will make major changes between what I hand in to Paul and what you read, and he is definitely a part of the chorus that helps me sort of think through what do I have too much of, what do I have too little of, who's not working, what's thematically confusing, and he also has a good ear for this sentence doesn't sound like you, this doesn't seem like it's consistent with the rest of your work here, and it might draw my attention to stuff like that. But
is Paul one of the 5 or 6 people who reads it first, and is Maggie?
Yeah, Maggie, I don't count her as one of the 5. She does get it the same day, but she is a beautiful and intelligent and kind person who is a terrible critic for my benefit, because she likes my work. She'll be like, oh, this is great, so I can't rely on her to be give me the hard this is a boring chapter, or whatever is part of what you need at that point.
Yeah, Carl is the same way.
Yes, I'm sure.
I have a friend whose partner makes big red hash marks over her pages and writes boring up the side. And I'm like, oh yeah, that would be worse.
Yes, right. I think Erik Larson's wife likes to put Z, Z. It's like, he turns the page, he's like, oh no,
Oh my. Hey, this one's from Margaret, again for both of you. She's curious about the intervals between your books. How are they balanced? Are you waiting for the idea to arrive and germinate, or is it more execution of the actual writing process?
I'll go first this time. For me, I have plenty of ideas. And so when a book is done, I sort of I have to go through them and say, okay, which of these ideas am I going to pursue? And, ideas that are in advanced stages. And so it's not a shortness of ideas. And that's partly because I've been writing since I was a kid, but I didn't get around to writing a finished novel for submission until my 40s. So I have a lot of backlog of ideas. So it's not that. It is for me that the amount of time it takes me to write a book and revise it to my satisfaction is turned out to be a multi-year cycle for me, 4 years or something like that. And, I'd love to shorten it a little, but I don't imagine shortening it much. And
So I was interviewing Louise Erdrich a while ago, and she said that she works on 4 or 5 books at the same time.
right.
And Lauren Groff said the same thing. She was like, I work on this, and then if I'm not just 100% there, I put it aside, I go on to another thing. And I thought, oh my God, I can't even imagine. I don't have the mental dexterity.
And The Night Watchman, Louise Erdrich's, book, which is lovely. I finished that, and I think I was like crafting a note to her about, my experience reading it, and in doing so, I suddenly realized, like, wait, she's got another book out. Like, I realized I had to mention the name of the book in my note to her because she'd already finished another book, and I was like, I thought this just came out like yesterday.
Right, Sentence is coming out in November, and it's fantastic. I love it.
But so I figured she must be doing things simultaneously to have a book like The Night Watchman and then have another one come out. So, although, Colson Whitehead, another very, one of the finest writers in the United States, but, much more prolific than I am, or than I am capable of being, and he seems to publish a terrific book every 2 years. So,
yeah, it's true.
Wow. Louise Erdrich. Wow.
I know.
Also a bookstore owner.
I know.
that's right.
And has 4 kids. Okay. 4 beautiful, talented, brilliant, kind, magical daughters in her spare time.
She has got to be a master at multitasking.
Yeah. Yeah.
I could use some of that. From Kelsey, for both of you, how do you celebrate when you finish writing a book?
Amor?
One, I like to celebrate in as many ways possible. That's generally my. I was known by my colleagues, I get a cappuccino and a chocolate croissant when something went well. 2 in the afternoon. Let's celebrate. I'm all for celebrating. And so at every step, my brother-in-law, I do like a cocktail, and among the different things that I drink, I love bourbon. And for those of you who drink bourbon, you know that Pappy Van Winkle is a very difficult bourbon to even obtain, and it's often sold by lottery because it's such a small batch sort of delivery. My brother-in-law John entered a lottery with the sole purpose of winning a bottle and giving it to me when I was writing A Gentleman in Moscow, because he knew I was a fan. So I protected that bottle, and then I drank that from finishing the first draft is when I opened it, and then I drank it over the course of editing the book, and then he gave me another one for the Lincoln Highway. And John, if you're listening, I'm starting another book pretty soon, so but yes. Although last night pub date, I was with my wife, my daughter, and my sister, and my old friend Hillary. We all had dinner, out last night to celebrate. So you kind of have opportunities to celebrate at different stages.
How about you, Ann?
I never know when it is over. What counts as the end? And frankly, what counts as the beginning? Like, I have started my new book. I'm on page 12. By New Year's, I will be on page 20 if I'm lucky. So I feel like if I say to my husband, oh my gosh, I finished my novel today, that's not true. No matter what does it even mean? Because then other people are going to read it, and you're going to edit it, and you're going to copy edit it. You're going to read the page proofs. It just drags on so incrementally.
So are you saying you don't have any, you clearly don't have the celebration instinct like I do?
I don't have this. Well, I don't drink. So
that's true. That's a factor.
It makes it hard. What do? I take the dog for another walk.
That's good. That's good.
So Sparky appreciates that.
Yeah, Sparky does.
Amor, there's several questions asking you about the painting behind you.
About this.
Can you tell us about it? Yes.
I'm sitting in sort of a sitting room in our home, and this is a painted backdrop. I think it's from like an old school play that my wife and I found in an antique shop, and so instead of wallpaper, that's what's here is this
Nice.
Painted canvas, this old cracked up canvas, which shows the countryside, because this was probably like, an 8th grade production of Midsummer Night's Dream or something like that, but I one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot in the aftermath of Lincoln Highway, and I think this is really what got me thinking about it, is this is going to sound strange, but is my relationship, how I think about history in my books, or I'm not a big researcher. Some of you may know, I don't pick a topic, research, and then write a book. I like to pick a topic that I know that's set in an arena that I'm familiar with and I'm fascinated with already. And then I try to write a book without doing any research. And at the end, I'll go and do some applied research. But if you think of like history for me in my book, it's the metaphor I've come to think about is it's like a stage play. That's where this comes in. A stage play, if you think of like a play of Chekhov, and in the back, there is a painted backdrop like this. Through the French doors, you can see the cherry orchard in the distance. And someone has painted that sort of a rough depiction of the trees in the distance. And that's as sharp as it needs to be, But in front of that, you then have, let's say bookcases that are made out of plywood and painted to look like mahogany. And there's a staircase leading nowhere and a door that, that leads nowhere. And so these fake aspects of stagecraft. And then in front of that, though, you have a table, a real table, real chairs, a real China tea service on the table. So that, when the actors sit down to have a conversation, you can hear the hand on the table and it sounds like the hand on the table. You can hear the way the China cup ends up in the saucer. And this is, for me, the way my books are. I mean, the way, maybe this is the way all novels are structured, or layered. And this is certainly the way mine, it was just that there's an aspect of history, in this case, say the 1950s, which is the painted backdrop for me. I'm kind of interested in, I only want it to be as done as well enough to be the illusion that adds to your general experience. In front of that, there's sort of some artificial things that are made up and that have been painted to look like mahogany, but the real focus for me is what's going on in front of stage, the characters and how they interact, the ideas and sentiments that they exchange. And, I think as we all know in the theater is, if that's not working, if the actors aren't believable, if what they have to say to each other is not compelling, then suddenly you're looking at the chandelier, and wondering like, when is dinner, and so for me, that's kind of the way I think about history. And as I say, it was partly because with Zooming, I kept looking at this myself, looking back at that, thinking, yeah, the painted backdrop, that's what it is. Anyway.
And can I just say, and Amor, I feel like I've told you this, but I'm not sure that you've completely taken it in. That backdrop, which I have looked at so often in the last year and a half when we have been talking on Zoom, that backdrop is going to be the cover of my next novel, which is about a play.
Yes, love it.
Orchard. And that's going to be the cover of my next novel.
Nothing would make us happier.
Thank you very much.
We're going to hold you to it, Ann. That's fantastic.
It's really true.
Oh, I'm so excited. Ann, do you want to say anything else about what you're working on?
Not particularly, but
Okay.
you know what's going to be on the cover. Okay, I just remembered something that I really wanted to ask.
Yeah.
You're one of the only writers that I know who never seemed to lose his mind during the pandemic. Did you lose your mind, but you were just too nice to tell me? Or was it the fact that you were so deep in this book? I feel like your kids were home, you moved to Garrison, but you just had your head down and kept working, and you didn't seem to fray. Is that true?
Yeah, that's pretty true. I
mean it in a congratulatory way.
Well, we have the luxury of not having a family member get sick. We had the luxury of being able to retreat to a place where there was enough space that we could, all be spread out. And, while we were in class, or, my wife running her store, or me doing my work. But above and beyond that, as an author, you spend a lot of time alone. And so that was not a problem.
Right.
Being in nature was a big plus.
Your whole life.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
So it was, I like to cook. I like to be outside, and I could do those things. I could, write, cook, and be with my family. Go outside in the afternoon, and so it was a luxury of having a sort of normalcy to our lives in a very abnormal and time that was very trying for the nation. I get it, but so yes, it was not if if I wasn't so deep in the book, it probably would have been more frustrating, for me, because that, of course, and you feel the same way, almost anything, that helps you get through almost anything when it's going well, because you can retreat into it, even when you've got something which is making you sad or frustrated or anxious in life, as things will.
You were my last house guest, my last pre-pandemic house. I mean, Suki was here, but you were our last visitor before the world shut down.
I shouldn't even have been there, right? Probably.
Yeah. You could have stayed for the whole pandemic. Oh, wait, Kathy, you're muted.
We had to make you say that at least once during this Zoom call.
Right.
So thank you. This is such an utter joy. I know the more than 700 people from around the country would agree with me. Thank you both. I want to wrap with one question from Lisa, who adores both of you and wonders if you could recommend books that you love. They can be from books that you've read in the past, or, what have you read right now that you're really excited about?
You have to go first, Ann. You're so much better than me.
Of course.
Really, really good at this game. I love the new Colson Whitehead Harlem Shuffle. If you loved Underground Railroad and Nickel Boys and found them really, really hard and soul carving, Harlem Shuffle is a giant reward. Liz Strout has a book coming out in a couple of weeks called Oh, William, which is a new Lucy Barton novel, which I think is her best book. And I adore Liz Strout. I love Louise Erdrich's book, which will be coming. I'm a bookseller, so I only read things in advance. The Sentence, which is coming out in November. Lily King has a collection of short stories coming out in November that are great. A book you may miss by Asali Solomon called Days of Afriquette is coming out in the next week or two. It has a bad cover, and I am so afraid that people are going to lose sight of it. It's a beautiful book. If you want to laugh, you want a smart book, you want to know what people want when they come into a bookstore, they want a smart book that makes them laugh. Meg Mason's Sorrow and Bliss. Fabulous. I can do this all day long.
Hey,
oh my God, the Beatrice Prophecies.
Really? The Beatrice Prophecy?
Why, look, it's the Beatrice Prophecies.
By Katie Camillo.
Amor, you've got to read the Beatrice Prophecies.
You are Katie Camillo's biggest advocate. I mean, and rightfully, she deserves it. But you are a big Kate Camillo fan.
I just feel like Katie Camillo is what the world needs right now, and I love her.
Absolutely, hard agree. How about you, Amor?
Somebody just flashed up that Sorrow and Bliss is one of the best books ever. Thank you.
What comes straight to mind is when I'm about to write a book, as kind of leading up to writing a book, I do like to, I'm not a researcher, as I said, but I do like to read a few novels that were ideally written in and set in the time period that I'm about to work, ideally both of those things. And so in preparation for writing this book, or you want to call it that, preparation, I read a series of books from the mid-50s that I had not read before, and including one case I had read before, Flannery O'Connor's first collection of short stories, A Good Man is Hard to Find, was written right around the time that this book, my book, takes place in 1954. James Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain. Oh my God, I'm going to forget his name, but the man who wrote The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, which was a very famous novel in the 50s and 60s and became a movie, and was sort of the first novel about kind of the guys who returned from the Second World War and became suburbanites, going into Manhattan every day in their gray suit with their briefcase and living this kind of weird new life. And
Sloan Wilson.
Thank you. And then Raymond Chandler's The Long Goodbye, which is sort of his greatest book. Later in the career of Philip Marlowe and in the career of Raymond Chandler. And what I loved about reading these four books kind of back to back is they're all kind of, as I say, written at that time, roughly about that time in terms of their underlying subject matter, but they couldn't be more different. Flannery O'Connor writing from this Gothic experience in the South, and Raymond Chandler doing his Southern California noir, and James Baldwin writing in New York City, but from the perspective of a Harlemite, an African American, where and Sloan Wilson, doing this sort of Greenwich, Connecticut, commute into Midtown, kind of the precursor to Mad Men. I'm sure Matt Weiner has read that book and thought about it, but so I enjoyed. It was great pleasure to read. All four of those are great books and sort of great sort of windows on the American experience. And, so I enjoyed those a lot.
Someone just asked me to repeat Days of Afriquette by Asali Solomon. There you go. There it is.
Sorry, I'm turning to the other computers to go into Ingram and figure out the titles.
Are we winding down? Is that what's
We're
going on?
winding down.
So before we do, I want to tell listeners sort of one sort of odd thing, about Lincoln Highway, which I think may intrigue them or whatever.
Yes, I know what you're going to say.
It's an odd sort of story, but so as I said, I immediately thought, okay, when I had this idea of this story, that it would be in the mid 50s, and I'm going to do two parts. Can I do two parts?
You can do two parts.
It's not even 9 o'clock yet, right? So the first thing, so and Ann would probably say this too. When you're writing, occasionally something drops from the heavens in the middle of your writing process, and it's like a gift from God, and you can't believe it when you stumble upon it. And for me, the biggest example in the case of writing Lincoln Highway is the Lincoln Highway itself. Because when I started this book, I did not know what the Lincoln Highway was. It was my book was not called the Lincoln Highway. I'd never heard of the Lincoln Highway, but early in the book, the characters are leaving this farm in Nebraska, and they've studied how their mother has gone west, and they're going to end up going east to New York. And I'm looking at a map of the Midwest and sort of trying to figure out what route are they going to take, sort of in my planning process. And suddenly I see, Route 30, and then it's kind of in parentheses, formerly the Lincoln Highway. I'm like, what? Formerly the what? So that is a thing where you set, note to self, find out what that is. So I did start digging into that. And it turns out it's the first highway that crossed America. And it was built by an entrepreneur in 1913, 14, 15, this guy who had made a fortune in sort of car parts, but as a patriot thought there should be a way you can drive across the country. Because at the time, the federal government was not involved in roads across the country. And so all roads kind of spidered out from metropolitan centers, but did not necessarily connect from state to state. And so he said, we're going to do it. So he raised money from the public, and Teddy Roosevelt gave him money, and Thomas Edison gave him money. The Boy Scouts raised money across the country, and it all went to go and build this thing, the first highway across the country, and he called it the Lincoln Highway. And now in my draft of my story, the characters are always going to end up going to Times Square, because that's where the theater world was, or it played an important part of the story. Well, it turned out that the Lincoln Highway starts in Times Square. When it was built in 1911, and you can go to Times Square today on 42nd Street and Broadway, and there is a street sign that says the Lincoln Highway, like a New York City street sign, where it begins. So as I say, this sort of comes crashing from the heavens down into my draft, and I'm like, oh my God, this it's a gift, right? It makes sense of all this stuff that I haven't been able to make sense of yet. That
Times Square is also where they famously count down.
Yes, that's a good. I hadn't even thought of that. Excellent point, Ann. The New Year count in Times Square. So that was the first thing I want to tell you. But the other thing was, and this is sort of a weird one. I always knew it was going to be in the 50s, as I said, and I basically was well into finishing the book, and all of a sudden I was like, in planning, I was like, oh, they're gonna have to go to this summer house as a part of the story, and it's got to be before summer. So maybe in June sometime, because the family can't be there yet. And so, and I want the days to be long because you're driving across the country. So, maybe, like late June is when it's going to take place. And so, for the 10 days, I'm writing the story. And suddenly I'm like, oh my God, this is happening in 1954 in June. And A Gentleman in Moscow ends in June 1954. On the 21st of June 1954 is the sort of the culminating moment of A Gentleman in Moscow, where the Count sort of leaves the hotel. And sorry for those of you who haven't read it, but anyway, but so you should have read it by now. But anyway, so this is, it happens on June 21st, 1954 at midnight is when that happens in the Gentleman Moscow. And so all of a sudden, like, well, I tinkered with my timeline a little bit. And now when you read the Lincoln Highway, it culminates, the culminating event for the main characters is at 5 p.m. on the 21st of June, 1954. And when you adjust for the time change, that means that the end of this book happens at the exact same moment in historical time as the end of A Gentleman in Moscow. And I love, such a great, that just makes me happy. It doesn't have to make you happy,
Right.
Because it's to me, it's everything you need to know about storytelling, right? That you can have a story about 10 days in America about young guys on this, misadventure that concludes at this moment in time. And you have a 30-year saga about a Russian, aristocrat. Then that story ends and culminates at the exact same moment in historical time, because that's what happens in life at any given moment. Right now, there are millions of stories ending and another million of stories beginning, in our daily life. And so I love that little sort of odd bit of overlap.
Did the same person design your 3 book jackets?
That's a good, same team.
Same
I
team?
don't know, and I should know the answer to your question, Ann, and I will find out tonight, but we did it very consciously.
That is such a good looking book.
Thank you.
That matters so much.
Yes, and
Tell
I
your
wanted I wanted a black and white photograph so that the book was sort of a cousin to A Gentleman in Moscow and Rules of Civility.
But
and
the whole red,
whole
white,
thing.
and blue,
Yeah.
the whole typeface, it's really fabulous.
And I'll say something else, Ann. It's nice because the red is red, white, and blue like America, but it's a little bit off red because it's also the blue and orange of Howard Johnson's. Almost. Yes.
Hysterical. Yeah, because the red is Tilton orange. Yeah.
It's spectacular. Both of you, thank you. This has been just glorious. And again, the communal experience of sharing story and reading a book together. It's what Kate DiCamillo says builds community. So we are so grateful. And speaking of community, I have had the great joy of working with the teams at the bookstall at Parnassus and at Boswell. And you will not find finer booksellers anywhere.
Thank you.
And well, it's a joy. Indie booksellers are a very special bunch. And all of you who are here have supported an indie bookstore. And we're very grateful to that. To everyone who was here, thank you. To Amor, thank you for writing beautiful, beautiful books. And the same to you. And thank you for being such a great conversationalist. I could sit here and listen to you for another 3 hours, but I'm not going to do that. Both of you have a lovely evening. Everyone else, thank you. Thank you so much for your support and have a super night. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Ann. Thanks, everybody, for coming.
Congratulations, Amor.
Thank you, Ann.